Hello everybody, Resonance here, and today I'll be giving you all my first impressions and review of all of the remaining One Night in Karazhan cards. So if you're new to Hearthstone and you'd like to support the channel, then I definitely recommend watching my Hearthstone tutorial first, link to it in the video description below. If you look on the screen, you'll be able to see a list of all the cards that I've covered so far, and we're going to be finishing up this list today. There's one thing I really enjoy doing, it's theory crafting. So this means that my card reviews will generally be more on the optimistic side in a similar style to Noxious. Overall, I'll be giving you all a combined perspective of my own opinions, the opinions of various expert players, and the overall community to help us figure out just how viable these cards might be. However, the thing I'm looking forward to doing the most is actually playing with these cards. And thankfully, on August 11th, which is just around the corner, I'll finally get a chance to. If you enjoyed this video, then please let me know by leaving a like and a comment below. I appreciate the support as always. Alright, so without further ado, let's start with the Shaman class card, the Spirit Claws. So let me really quickly shift back into the actual game itself. So we're going to be starting with the Shaman class card today because we just finished with the Rogue ones. I was talking a little bit about Deadly Fork in the last video, which I think is a decent card. I am not sure if it will see constructed play, but I do think that it is okay enough that I wouldn't be horribly surprised. And now we're on the Shaman card's Spirit Claws. So the thing with Spirit Claws is that both Tice and Kibler happen to like it a lot. I forget which one of them said that they believe it's the one Shaman card revealed in this set that they have faith will actually see competitive play. And overall, I do think that this card's actually crazy, but what I like about it is it's not one of those like auto-include cards that you just have to slap in a deck and you feel like you're shoehorned into adding into every deck, kind of like, you know, Pilot Shredder, for example. So Spirit Claws makes you think a little bit differently about the cards you put in your deck. It's a 1 mana, 1/3 weapon that has +2 attack while you have spell damage. Now, isn't that interesting? It's even more interesting because the Shaman hero power can summon spell damage totems. So this means that you can actually, you don't even necessarily need to fill your deck with spell damage minions to get value out of this. But first, to figure out just how good this card is, we need to compare it to existing weapons in the game. And if you want to know what one of the best weapons in the game is, it's Fiery War Axe. This card is absolutely nuts. Although I don't think that you can use Fiery War Axe, though, as a benchmark for, you know, generic good weapon, because most weapons are just nowhere near as good as Fiery War Axe. We figured out, you know, with cards like, for example, Rallying Blade, that honestly, we would probably play a 3 mana 3/2 weapon in the right metagame, even if it had no text on it, where the text wasn't relevant that often. You know, we see the same thing with Eagle Horn Bow, where a lot of people just play it as a 3 mana 3/2 weapon. So, in general, Spirit Claws is going to be really insane as long as you can proc it. A 1/3 weapon, though, is really, really bad, and you would compare it to a card like Light's Justice, which is actually, believe it or not, legitimately okay in Arena, but will never really see constructed play unless it's attached to another card, so you have to actually activate the ability on Spirit Claws for it to be good. But activating it is actually not going to be that tricky. So let's look at a couple things that I think would work really well with this card. Blood Mage Thalnos, I think, would be excellent. You can play Spirit Claws on turn 1. This is another thing I think that people are missing with this card and why I think it's so strong, is that you can play Spirit Claws on turn 1, and then use it to ping off like a 2/1 minion that your opponent plays on turn 1. That's fine. Like or a 1/1. Use a 1 health minion. And then the next turn you play a spell damage minion like Blood Mage Thalnos, or you totem, and since you're really skilled at Hearthstone, you get the spell damage one, of course, every time. Spirit Claws becomes insane. You don't need every single proc of the weapon to be on the 3 damage for it to be good. You can play it on turn 1 and then play your turn 2 spell damage minion, and even though you're missing a charge, you just played Fiery War Axe in a class that's not Warrior. That's nuts. Like, if every class had a Fiery War Axe, I think almost all of them would just play it. So, Spirit Claws, it's okay if you have to waste one of the charges. But what if you don't? Then you have a 3 mana 3/3 weapon. I gotta hop back to Wild to show you just how crazy it actually is. But, like, basically... Oh yeah, I have to do it from here. I always forget that. Right, all cards, there we go. Like, it's pretty ridiculous when you think about it, but let's compare it to the Cogmaster's Wrench, and then you can see why a 3 mana 1/3 weapon that conditionally gets +2 attack is really bad. So Spirit Claws is so much better than Cogmaster's Wrench, which was awful. It's 2 mana better. Spirit Claws is going to be ridiculous, I think. I think it's going to be a great card that people will experiment with. The question is, though, is like, even though Shaman as a class can take full advantage of spell damage with their wide variety of spells, and they also have the spell damage totem, will it be enough that this card actually finds a home in competitive Hearthstone? That's difficult to say, but in a vacuum, this card is very strong. I think you would play it with Blood Mage Thalnos, cards like Azure Drake. I think you would want to use it with. Besides that, though, you don't really have that many great spell damage options. Like the Kobold Geomancer is okay. Maybe you run them, but you end up weakening your deck a lot if you run too many spell damage minions, so maybe you don't actually run as many of them. And maybe the card is still good regardless. So, Spirit Claws, something to definitely be on the lookout for. Now we're on to Wicked Witchdoctor, which is a 4-mana, 3/4 Shaman card. It's a minion, and it says, whenever you cast a spell, summon a random basic totem. First off, when evaluating this card, let's talk a little bit about just the body. Always focus on the body first, and then we have to figure out exactly how much is this text worth, and then keep an open mind and do some playtesting. So, the 3 mana is generally going to be a 3/4 body, and I think our benchmark for this is going to be our good friend Mr. Spider Tank, Infested Wolf, or Ball of Spiders. Mr. Spider Tank over here is going to be our benchmark 3-mana minion, where he just has good enough stats to see some play, especially since he has the mech tag. So 3-mana 3/4, just like the 4-mana 4/5 Chillwind Yeti, etc. This means that the ability on Wicked Witchdoctor must be worth at least 1 mana for this card to be considered. Otherwise, Wicked Witchdoctor is going to get creamed by all the 4-mana minions that your opponent plays with just have better stats. It's worth noting that it summons a random basic totem, not a random totem. So the card that is most immediately comparable to is actually going to be our Tuskar Totemic card, which summons any random totem. This is nuts because more often, you can get all these other totem cards, which I will go filter for right now, like the Totem Golem, which is a huge tempo swing. You can also get things like Flame Tongue Totem, or Mana Tide Totem, for example, that make cards like Tuskar Totemic so very strong. Wicked Witchdoctor is going to be a lot weaker than this, because you have to, it's not a battle cry, it's whenever you cast a spell, but at the same time, if this thing lives, then you can get so much value of just swarming the board with totems. Perhaps the biggest weakness that Brian Kibler notes with this card is that there's a 7-minion limit. You can only have 7 minions on the board at a time, and if you fill your board with totems, which is actually not that hard, considering that Shaman has insanely strong class cards. Shaman is one of the few classes where you can actually fill a deck with 30 Shaman cards. It's not a joke. You don't really need neutral cards, which means there's plenty of room for a heavily spell-based Shaman. It's just you fill your board with totems. It's actually not that crazy. It doesn't really give you that much board presence, so you have to be kind of careful with that, because if it was summoning any random totem, then with the help of Flame Tongues, Totem Golems, and Mana Tide Totems, that you actually have a very threatening board, which you don't get with Wicked Witchdoctor. I think that Wicked Witchdoctor would be good if there weren't so many ridiculously powerful Shaman cards currently. Would you really play Wicked Witchdoctor in the 4-mana slot when you could be playing, for example, the Flame Wreath Faceless? You could be playing Master of Evolution. You could be playing Fireguard Destroyer. Obviously, Flame Wreath Faceless would be the most powerful of the bunch. So, will Wicked Witchdoctor see any competitive play? It depends. I think that one is a little bit more fringe viable than Spirit Claws, but it's certainly not so bad. Moving on, we have Maelstrom Portal, which the most directly comparable card to it would be Arcane Explosion. So, Maelstrom Portal is a 2-mana Shaman spell that says deal 1 damage to all enemy minions, summon a random 1-cost minion. So the card this is most comparable to will be our good friend Arcane Explosion, which is just a 2-mana mage spell, deal 1 damage to all enemy minions. I think a lot of people will look at this card and be like, whoa, power creep, but it's important to note that not every class is balanced the same, and that, Warrior is Fiery War Axe, but everyone else is 3-mana 3/2 weapons, for example, so Maelstrom Portal isn't necessarily going to break the game because Arcane Explosion exists, and I'm okay with cards like that existing as long as, Maelstrom Portal's not really a mage card. I would rather them just take Arcane Explosion in that case and just tack on the extra text. Arcane Explosion has seen actually some fringe competitive play, believe it or not. It's okay, but it's not so great. Tack on a random 1-cost minion, that makes it a little bit better, Is that enough to make it really good? Not so much, maybe, because 1-mana minions aren't really worth that much in general. On average, you're going to get like a 1-1 or like a 1-2 body, which is really weak. I think the thing that would make Maelstrom Portal good is the only thing that would ever make Arcane Explosion good, and the secret is spell damage, my friend. And the Shaman has the spell damage totem, and we talked about Blood Mage Thalnos, Azure Drake, and the possibility of running perhaps other spell damage minions. That remains to be seen how many you would run. Then Maelstrom Portal has some potential. It could be a little bit of a cheaper board clear, would help out against the Zoo Warlock or any sort of deck that likes to flood the board with lots of cheap minions. Another thing with Shaman is that they have like a lot of trouble dealing with like a lot of small minions. They have excellent removal for big minions, and they have excellent board clears with things like Elemental Destruction, for example, and Lightning Storm, which is kind of like mandatory if you want to play any sort of mid-range or control Shaman. That they really just have a lot of difficulty dealing with a lot of small minions without really overloading themselves to death, and Maelstrom Portal has no overload, which is very important. So I think that you would have to structure your deck a little bit differently than what we've seen from existing Shaman decks, but this is a card to watch out for as it is potentially playable. It seems decent. Moving on, we already looked at Malchezaar's Imp in part 1, and now we're on to Warlock class cards. Let's talk about Karazhan. Karazhan is a 5-mana Warlock spell. Summon a 1/1 Candle, 2/2 Broom, and 3/3 Teapot. How good is this? Well, let's compare it to existing cards in the game. This is a mistake, though, that I think... is there space? That I think a lot of players make, which is, yes, we should be comparing cards to existing cards in the game, but the metagame may shift. So, if we compare this card to Silverhand Knight, we see the big 4/4 body has been split into a candle and a teapot. How good is Silverhand Knight? Very good in Arena, not so great in Constructed. I don't think you can entirely look at it this way, though, because they're not identical cards, and also the metagame could shift. Who knows, maybe Silverhand Knight becomes a staple. I'm not sold yet, but it's just something to consider, because it could happen. There are plenty of cards that people dismiss as bad, and then metagame shifts, and people realize they're wrong. I don't think that Karazhan will be one of them, though, but I will keep an open mind. What makes Karazhan interesting? Also, you could compare it to Force of Nature, which just summons 3 2/2 Trends. Out of all those cards that I looked at, Force of Nature, Silverhand Knight, and Karazhan, which one's the best one? It really depends. It's situational. But the thing is though, it's kind of nice to have 3 bodies if you're a Warlock, because usually they like to flood the board because they're abusing this spell that people really enjoy called Power Overwhelming, which can turn your 1/1 candle into a 5/5 candle and allow you to get an excellent trade. You don't care if the minion dies at the end of your turn horribly because you're using it for an excellent value trade. So this is very useful with things like Power Overwhelming and Abusive Sergeant, which are kind of the cornerstones of the Zoo deck, or at least they're just 2 cards that really make the archetype work so super duper well. So Karazhan having an extra body is actually kind of decent, but perhaps one of the more interesting things about it is that it's actually a spell. Do I have Cho'Gall on this account? I do. Oh my goodness. It's a spell, and it's actually a very strong tempo swing of Cho'Gall. Cho'Gall, the 7-mana Warlock legendary. the next spell you cast this turn costs health instead of mana. That's a huge swing turn, so that's really strong with Cho'Gall. It's also really good with Yogg-Saron, as it's just something that summons more minions to the board to help you make up for all the minions that Yogg-Saron ended up blowing up. By the way, it's worth noting that Yogg-Saron is actually competitively viable. On average, if you cast a lot of spells with it, the outcome is actually generally going to be positive. It just means that everything dies, which is pretty good. I don't think Karazhan will see constructed play. I don't think it's that good of a card. It's not awful, though. I mean, it's certainly okay in Arena, and it has some decent synergy with Cho'Gall. I think it's a little too slow for a Zoo deck. I don't think it... Maybe you run it in a Reno Jackson Warlock, but I really doubt it. I don't think this card will see competitive play, but it's not awful. Moving on to the Silverware Golem. This is a card that I remember Tice really hates this card. He thinks it's absolutely broken, and it's just very swingy. So Silverware Golem is a 3-mana Warlock minion that reads, it's a 3-mana 3/3. If you discard this minion, summon it. Now that is power. We were talking a little bit in the previous, in part 1 of my card review about Malchezaar's Imp, which is the card up here whenever you discard a card, draw a card. Now that I'm seeing the bigger picture, Malchezaar's Imp is probably better than I thought it was. And in fact, it just has decent stats in its own, so... Silverware Golem, kind of, like... Okay, so when you discard a card and you draw a card to replace it, discarding a card's still a drawback. However, if you discard a card and you summon this thing for free, that's not a drawback, that's an insane upside. Before, we were just mitigating the downside of discarding a card. Now we're turning it into an insane tempo swing benefit, where you can discard a card, then you draw it back with Malchezaar's Imp, and you get your Silverware Golem in play. Also, it has okay enough stats, a 3-mana 3/3, that it's not going to lose you the game when you play it. I mean, sure, you're not going to run a 3-mana 3/3 on your own, but you want it to at least be a 3/4, but Silverware Golem is going to be a 0-mana 3/3 a lot of the time, where you can really just abuse the discard effects. So, overall, I actually think this card is absolutely insane, and in addition to things like Beast Druid, I've certainly got my eyes peeled with this guy. You know, I think that Darkshire Librarian was already a decent card in itself. Tiny Knight of Evil is okay. Fist of Jaraxxus is something that you'd probably run, but Fist of Jaraxxus isn't nearly as consistent as Silverware Golem. You'd much rather have the minion on the board or Fist of Jaraxxus not punching people in the face. Doomguard's really strong. Soulfire is really strong. I think that Silverware Golem could certainly see some competitive play, and this might be the thing that makes the Discard Warlock deck a thing. I think Discard Warlock in general is not going to run Succubus, even though if you do play turn 2 Succubus and then you discard a Silverware Golem, that's insane. I still don't think you run that combo. I don't think Succubus is good enough in its own right to warrant it, but there are enough tools in Discard Warlock it could be a thing. Like a whole new type of Zoo deck where you're running all sorts of cheap early game minions that benefit from discard, or they make you discard cards, and then you just keep life tapping and drawing back with Malchezaar's Imp. It could honestly work and finish them off with some Doomguards. Overall, I think this card is very strong, and it's something I'm on the lookout for as potentially really, really good. I don't think you would put this in an existing Zoo deck, but maybe you do, just because you're already running Doomguards, and it's a lot of them run Soulfire, so... Yeah, Silverware Golem could either spur on an entirely new deck archetype, or maybe that and Malchezaar's Imp just kind of merge their way into the current Zoo list. Remains to be seen. Moving on to Warrior class cards. We're on to Fool's Bane. Fool's Bane is a 5-mana warrior weapon, and it is 3 attack and 4 durability, so you can attack for 3 damage 4 times, and whenever you hit a minion, remember your hero takes the damage. The text reads, unlimited attacks each turn, but you can't attack heroes with this weapon. This is really interesting card design. It's something I like a lot. I do think that this card is pretty decent, and the most accurate comparison would probably be Assassin's Blade. It's a 5-mana 3/4 weapon, which in its own right is already decent. With Fool's Bane, you can't use it to attack heroes, though. But you can use it to basically clear a board, and previously warriors were reliant on cards like Brawl, for example, as a board clear, but now they don't really have to worry about that as much, and since warriors have the ability to armor up, every turn they gain 2 armor, which can stack over their flat 30 HP that all heroes start with. So if there's any class that has the ability to leverage a weapon that can attack unlimited times but can't attack heroes, that was going to be Warrior. Warrior can use Fool's Bane to clear a board of weak minions, and then they don't really care about taking all that extra damage because they'll be gaining so much armor. So overall, I think Fool's Bane is actually a great card, and it could see competitive play. But it's a weird card. We haven't really seen one like this, so it can be a little bit difficult to evaluate at a glance. By the way, if we're looking back at Silverware Golem, I remember that Strife Crow also didn't actually think this card was that great, so... while this card is very swingy, it's something that's polarizing, so we'll have to see whether it just turns out that it's not actually that great, or it turns out to be insanely OP. We'll have to find out. Silverware Golem, I think, is good. I don't think it will destroy Hearthstone, though, but, we'll see. It's going to take some creative deck building, I think, to really abuse it to its full potential. Fool's Bane, by the way, which I do think is a decent card with potential for constructed play, much like Silverware Golem, although I'd rate it a little bit lower than Silverware Golem. It's really funny with Heroic Strike, a card that has historically seen very little competitive play outside of, like, Aggro Pirate Warrior, or just Aggro Warrior. Heroic Strike means that your Fool's Bane is now a 7-attack weapon that you can swing unlimited times per turn. Ooh, that's pretty sick. You can also run Upgrade with it, of course, which is also pretty decent. Overall, Fool's Bane, Looks like it's an interesting card, and it's one that I'm looking forward to playing around with. Obviously, you're probably not going to run this in Aggro Warrior, although maybe you do for the board control. We'll have to see. Moving on, Ironforge Portal. This is a card that is no one can agree on as well. It looks a little bit overpriced. Initially I'm skeptical about this card, but I'm going to go out on a whim here, and I'm just going to say that this card is actually decent enough that it could see constructed play. Yeah, I'd put it on a similar level to the Fool's Bane weapon, in that this card has potential, and I think people might be underrating it. The thing is that people have historically been wrong about cards that put a body on the board and gain you armor. I'm looking at you, Shieldmaiden. Everybody told me that this card was garbage. Because, 6 mana 5/5 body is passable, but not so great, and gaining 5 armor isn't so great. Or so people thought, but it turns out that when you combine a body with some health gain, it's actually really, really strong. And I look at Priest of the Feast, and I treat it in a similar situation to Shieldmaiden, where Shieldmaiden turned out to be great. Ironforge Portal could turn out to be great as well. Another great one is Ancient Shieldbearer, is a card that some people also really underestimated. How much armor do you really want to gain? Is gaining 10 armor that good for a body that's not so great? Yes, in Warrior it certainly is, as you want to get to the late game to play your big, beefy minions. Thing is, though, the Ironforge Portal seems like it might be slightly on the weaker side compared to these, just because gaining 4 armor is worse than getting 5, obviously. It does only cost 5 mana. And summoning a random 4-cost minion, 4-cost minions are generally not such great value for their cost. So, because a lot of them have like battlecry effects, like Defender of Argus is the one that certainly comes to mind. So, this is a tricky card. Are people sleeping on it? Not entirely sure. Yeah, something to keep my eyes on. At the very least, it's okay in Arena, but honestly, getting armor is not nearly as good in Arena as it is in Constructed, so. I think that this card is okay. It's also worth noting that there aren't really that many nice ways for Warriors to gain armor outside of Cthulhu decks, and with Shieldmaiden rotating out of Standard, which it already did, perhaps Ironforge Portal has a home? Not entirely sure. It seems okay. It would have been nice, honestly, to have seen like more control Warlock cards revealed, rather than more, I guess, like discard Zoo Warlock. Like, I really would have liked to have seen some cards that just fit nicely in like a Reno Warlock, or maybe something to bring a Handlock back rather than more Zoo cards. But at least it's a new archetype, so I like to see them pushing that. Alright, let's start moving on to the neutral minions. Oh, wait, no, I still have one more warrior card left. We have Protect the King. Protect the King is a 3-mana warrior spell. For each enemy minion, summon a 1/1 pawn with taunt. This is a really, really interesting card. Yeah, this is the last one, I think. At a glance, I think that this card, this one's hard. I like that they're making cards like this that are difficult to evaluate, so I can't wait to see how they actually turn out. This seems to be kind of like anti-synergistic with Fiery War Axe, since Warrior has such great tools to control the board early that your opponent might just not have that many minions in the board for Protect the King to get that much value. You could always just not swing with the axe, but that could be a little bit suspicious. So, Protect the King at a glance seems to have like anti-synergy with things like Fiery War Axe or Ravaging Ghoul, for example. So, yeah, it's interesting. I think that the most obvious thing that people will tell you about this card is that it's insane with Bolster. So you can put down Bolster, summon like 7 1/1 pawns with taunt, and then bolster them all up to 3/3s. That's a little bit ambitious because if you summon 7 1/1 pawns with taunt, you're very far behind, and bolstering them to 3/3s might not do enough. Then you fill your board with 3/3 mummy zombies. Sure, your opponent has to get through that, but chances are if you're losing that hard, you're still probably going to lose. I think this card is okay, though. And that you can compare it to other various cards like Unleash the Hounds, which is a 3-mana hunter spell for each enemy minion, summon a 1/1 hound with charge. You can compare it to Unleash the Hounds. I think it's slightly worse than Unleash the Hounds because you'd rather have charge and decide where you want your 1/1s to trade. That's one of the big strengths of Unleash the Hounds, as opposed to Taunt. But since they have Taunt, you could also kind of compare it to Frost Nova, which just freezes all enemy minions. This is the type of card that buys you an extra turn. It means that every single enemy minion that your opponent has, they have to spend a turn, they take 1 damage and they don't get to deal any damage to you, which is great. This is a good way to stall, kind of stabilize the board, and will really improve Warrior's matchup versus Zoo. And it's also decent in the later stages of the game. I think this card is okay, but it might take some creative deck building to really see the full potential from it. Will it make Bolster Warrior viable? Not entirely sure, because the deck archetype already runs into a lot of problems. Taunt minions are always missing like one stat, and that means they don't trade very well, so... Will Protect the King make it good enough? I'm not entirely sure, but this card has potential. Alright. Whew. Gotta survive through the rest of this. We're on to neutral minions. Arcane Anomaly, a 1-mana 2/1. Whenever you cast a spell, give this minion +1 health. Immediately comparable to... I'm gonna try and speed through the rest of these. Mana Wyrm. It's like a reverse Mana Wyrm. Mana Wyrm is whenever you cast a spell, gain 1 attack. Arcane Anomaly I actually think is pretty good. And this is the type of card that could certainly see some constructed play. Some great combos with it are going to be Power Word Shield. Because with Power Word Shield, you're turning this into a 1-mana 2/5, and you drew a card, so it's really, really excellent. Perhaps Priest will end up running this. Remains to be seen. It's also, I haven't heard anyone really mention this yet, but Divine Strength is really cute with this card. You can have such a strong... Yeah, you get a 1-mana 3/4 with Arcane Anomaly with Divine Strength. That's actually pretty excellent. Well, I mean, it costs 2 mana. So you get a 2-mana 3/4 with Arcane Anomaly, which is actually very strong, so... Overall, I would say that Arcane Anomaly certainly has some potential to see competitive play. I think it's a very decent card, and it's something that in Arena will make players look more towards drafting spells to improve their deck strength. Moving on, we have Runic Egg. I think that Runic Egg is not very good. It is a 1-mana 0/2 with Death Rattle, draw a card, so immediately comparable to cards like Nerubian Egg, which I totally butchered that spelling. Yes, immediately comparable to Nerubian Egg, which is 2-mana 0/4, Death Rattle, summon a 4/4 Nerubian. Drawing a card for 1 is really, really good. And Blizzard has to be very careful about printing 1-mana cards that draw you cards. Good news is for them is, I don't think Runic Egg is going to break the game. Like, another comparison is going to be Dragon Egg, but I feel like if you're going to be running Egg minions, that you would rather run Dragon Egg for the board presence compared to Runic Egg. You have to jump through so many hoops to draw that card that I don't think drawing a card is going to be that big of an upside to really warrant everything that you have to go through. I don't think you put it in like a Zoo deck with like Power Overwhelmings, Abusive Sergeants, and Defender of Argus, just because Zoo doesn't really care that much about drawing the cards in the first place, so overall I don't expect Runic Egg to see much, if any, competitive play, but we'll see, and I don't even think it really has a home in Death Rattle decks, but maybe. I mean, 1-mana draw card can't be ignored, even though this card seems pretty unexciting. Moving on, Netherspite Historian, a 2-mana 1/3 Battlecry. If you're holding a dragon, discover a dragon. I think that this card would have been so great if Velen's Chosen was still in the game, but alas, it got rotated out of Standard. Now, this is the type of card where it's very good in a more control-style dragon deck in Hearthstone, so I think this card will see some competitive play. I think it's decent, but the 1/3 body isn't that threatening. You can immediately compare it to the Museum Curator, except here it doesn't really help you curve out as much because most of the dragons are going to be on the more expensive side of things. So this doesn't really help with your curve that much, but it has a very powerful effect. Like, I think that people have underrated Discover effects a lot. A lot of people have been complaining about One Night in Karazhan, and they feel like it's like going to be a worse expansion than League of Explorers, but nobody was excited about League of Explorers initially. It just turns out that everybody was wrong. And I expect that this to be a similar situation, where everyone looked at all the Discover cards and like, why would you ever play Jeweled Scarab? Why would you play Museum Curator? Same thing with Netherspite Historian. I think this card has some potential, but it's not insane. It's going to be good in control dragon decks. We already have like aggro dragon decks like Dragon Warrior, so I don't think that this will really fit into that, but hopefully this is the type of thing that revitalizes the Dragon Priest. And if you have some buffs to make the body more threatening, then it could be really, really great. Another thing about this is that in Mage, the body is going to be more relevant as well due to the fact that your hero power gets to deal 1 damage, allowing you to get some trades. Really, the viability of Netherspite Historian just depends on the strength of a 2-mana 1/3 in the context of the current metagame, so if a 2-mana 1/3 doesn't trade too horribly, then Netherspite Historian is great. Moving on to Pantry Spider. Pantry Spider is a really, really cute looking minion. It is a 3-mana 1/3 beast, Battlecry, summon a 1/3 spider. So it is a neutral beast. You can kind of compare it to a 3-mana 1/6 beast, and I feel like a lot of players have made the mistake of comparing it to a 3-mana 2/6 beast, because I don't think that's a fair evaluation. Because remember, the individual beasts themselves only have 1 attack, so it's going to be worse than a 2/6 beast. Crip actually thinks it's decent in aggressive decks because it can, summons 2 difficult to remove bodies that you could very easily buff. Still though, I'm very skeptical about the viability of this card. I don't think that Beast Druids would run it, and especially considering that, Druid already has a lot of good 3-mana beasts. It has the Druid of the Flame, and it already has Mounted Raptor, so I really feel like you're not running Pantry Spider in that deck, even though you have things like Mark of Yeshuraj to actually buff it up. I still feel like you're not actually going to be running Pantry Spider, and I don't think that this card will see that much competitive play, because the body just doesn't trade very well. Moving on, we're on to Pompous Thespian, which is a 2-mana 3/2 with Taunt. This isn't a particularly exciting card to look at, but I don't think it's as bad as it gets credit for. Pompous Thespian, it's a 3-mana 3/2 with Taunt, so it's certainly going to be better than our poor friend Mr. Frostwolf Grunt in 99% of circumstances. This doesn't really bother me, though, if they are releasing cards that are better than cards that have never seen competitive play. And Frostwolf Grunt has never been good enough, and it will never be good enough to see competitive play. So, while I would prefer they just buff up Frostwolf Grunt, it doesn't do any damage to the game that they don't. So I think it's fine that they release things like Pompous Thespian, even though I know some people will be upset about that. I would have more problems if they were power creeping over cards that had already seen a significant amount of competitive play, like maybe there's a Mega Fireball, a 4-mana, deal 8 damage. That, I think, would be very toxic for the game, whereas Pompous Thespian, not so much. Pompous Thespian is actually very not so good, I think, because people are going to be trading in the early game anyway, and a 2-mana 3/2 with Taunt, the Taunt doesn't matter that much, and you're not going to play a 2-mana 3/2 anyway. I don't think that this will have a home in a Bolster Warrior deck because, well, we already have Sparring Partner, which is just better than Pompous Thespian. That's all. We already have a 2-mana 3/2 Taunt, and it just wasn't good enough, so I don't think Pompous Thespian is really going to matter that much. I think, though, it'll be decent in Arena. Moving on, we have Violet Illusionist, which is a very, very interesting card. It's a 3-mana 4/3 neutral minion. During your turn, your hero is immune. So obviously you want to be playing this card with weapons, especially Fool's Bane, which we were looking at earlier, that 5-mana 3/4 warrior weapon that can't attack heroes but can attack an unlimited amount of times. If you have Violet Illusionist on the board, your hero will take no damage. So Violet Illusionist is going to be very strong in classes with weapons, particularly Warrior and Rogue, I believe, because Paladin already has some excellent healing. And then we also look at classes like Warlock, because Warlock's hero power deals damage to itself and draws a card, so Violet Illusionist means you don't have to take that damage. Another interesting thing about Violet Illusionist is that you don't take fatigue damage, so when you run out of cards in Hearthstone, every time you try to draw, you take an increasing amount of damage. Violet Illusionist will prevent that from happening. Overall, the body is decent. It would be much better if it was a 3/4, because it's a defensive effect, but on an offensive body. Overall, this card has some insane potential. It's difficult to evaluate, and I'm really looking forward to experimenting with it. This is a really cool card, and I think it will be good. Moving on, we've got Zoobot. Zoobot is a 3-mana 3/3 mech neutral minion. Battlecry, give a random friendly beast, dragon, and murloc +1/+1. This is immediately comparable to pre-nerf Shattered Sun Cleric. So, Shattered Sun Cleric is a 3-mana minion. Battlecry, give a friendly minion +1/1. It used to be a 3/3, I believe, back in Hearthstone Beta, if I recall. It's been a while. That was actually very strong, and Zoobot is very much comparable to it, but better than the pre-nerf Shattered Sun Cleric in some aspects, but it's also more linear, because you could buff anything. It doesn't matter what tag the minion has. Still, though, you could buff multiple minions, and if you do with Zoobot, and you buff a beast, dragon, and a murloc, then that's insane. And if you buff only one, it's still decent, and it's also a mech. Overall, I think Zoobot is a pretty good card, and it could see some competitive play. I don't think this is like a huge bomb card, but it's certainly good enough that it will see some heavy experimentation. I don't think people will necessarily play it with the Curator, and I don't really know how well the Beast, Dragon, Murloc triple tribe deck will work out, but I think Zoobot will see some experimentation. It's a decent card to look out for. Because really, it's only missing one stat point, and if it buffs one thing, then it's good, and if it buffs two things, it's crazy. You don't need to run all 3 tribes for Zoobot to be good. Moving on, we're on to Arcanosmith. This is a 4-mana 3/2 neutral minion. Battlecry, summon a 0/5 minion with Taunt. Now, while this might seem insane, like you have a 4-mana 3/7 minion with taunts, unfortunately, since the 0/5 body has no attack, it's not going to help you trade that well. The 0/5 minion is going to be like summoning a shield bearer, which used to see play in Zoo Warlock back in the day, but not so much anymore. The body, like, Arcanosmith is going to be really good with buff cards. Things like Flame Tongue Totem, for example, could make this card pretty good. And it's going to be really good with things like Direwolf Alpha as well. The bodies, though, on their own, if you're not playing these buff cards, then it might not be that great. Let me just get to that Direwolf Alpha. Yeah. Arcanosmith seems alright to me. I don't know if this card will see that much competitive play, but it's decent, and it's going to be okay in Arena, but I think it had to be kind of creative to make this work. You had to find a way to abuse both bodies and turn the 0/5 body into a threat of some sort, and I think the Flame Tongue Totem is going to be your best bet to making sure that you get the most value out of both bodies. This card seems a little below average. Who knows, though? I would like to be surprised. Menagerie Magician. So this is like Zoobot's big sister, or brother. I think that's a sister in this case. So Menagerie Magician is a 5-mana 4/4 battlecry. Give a random friendly beast, dragon, and murloc +2/+2. If you hit 2 of these, that's ridiculous. If you hit 1 of these, it's okay, and if you hit all 3, it's ridiculous. I think, though, that people shouldn't be planning to hit all 3. Unless you're trying to have fun, which I know I will be. I'm going to certainly try a triple tribe deck, but I don't think you need to hit 3 for this to be good. If you hit 1, it's okay, and if you hit 2, it's already really good, so I'd probably consider maybe running this in, like, a Paladin deck with, like, Murloc Knights, and then, like, some dragons, for example, so I don't think, though, that you need to run all 3 for this card. This one takes a significant stat penalty compared to Zoobot, though, so maybe it does make it a little bit worse than Zoobot. We'll have to see. It's still not really clear yet, though, if a 3-tribe deck will be good enough, but this is a card that I'm looking forward to experimenting with, and I don't think you need to run all 3 tribes for it to be good. I don't know if this will see competitive play, though. Seems a little tricky to get value out of it, and a 5-mana 4/4 body is pretty weak. Moving on, we have Avian Watcher. This is a 5-mana 3/6 battlecry. If you control a secret, gain +1/1 and taunt. So essentially, it's like a huge Fen Creeper. It's a 5-mana 4/7 with taunt if you control a secret, and the secret that you're going to be playing this with is probably going to be Ice Block, because it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to actually remove that, and that means you can reliably proc Avian Watcher. Will this be good enough to carry secret decks? I am not entirely sure. Yeah, I remember the Tice thinks that this card's bad because secrets aren't seeing that much play now, maybe outside of Hunter, and the stats are kind of comparable to Sludge Belcher, but Sludge Belcher is just going to be generally better than Avian Watcher. We'll take a look at Sludge Belcher, but Sludge Belcher is not also in the standard rotation currently. I do think that Avian Watcher is a little bit better than it gets credit for, but that this is not the type of card that's really going to shake up the metagame. If secret decks are a thing, I think this is something that is worth considering running. This card seems decent. Moving on, Bookworm, a 6-mana 3/6 dragon. Battlecry, if you're holding a dragon, destroy an enemy minion with 3 or less attack. So what this has is it has the Shadow Word Pain attached to the body. Shadow Word Pain is worth 2 mana, so this is essentially a 4-mana 3/6 dragon with the Shadow Word Pain tacked onto it. But remember, we can't just combine the effects like that. We have to remember that when we combine the 2 cards, that the card is actually a lot better than it seems, because you don't have to run both of them. And although I do think in this case you'd still be running Shadow Word Pain. So overall, Bookworm seems decent. This card, though, is a little bit strange, and I think it's been rather controversial because it is tricky to evaluate. Now, Tice thinks it's bad because you're overpaying too much for a conditional effect. And particularly, you know, Crip also mentions that you're very unlikely to have a good target on turn 6 for this. If this was a much smaller, downsized dragon, then Bookworm might actually be very, very strong. It's just that by the time turn 6 comes around, you play this guy, there aren't going to be that many, you know, 3 attack or less minions for Bookworm to kill. I do think that there will actually be a reasonable amount of them, and it won't be as big of a drawback as it seems. But still, you're going to run into some consistency issues. Strikebro thinks that this card is going to be very good versus Dragon Warrior due to the abundancy of 3 attack minions, especially in that deck. You know, it's a very good target to kill Alex Strauss's champion with. Overall, I do think the Bookworm is better than it seems, because I feel like you will be able to more reliably proc it on turn 6 than most people think, and we look at Stampeding Kodo as a card that's seen some resurgence. Bookworm will be able to deal with cards like Doomsayer, which you run Stampeding Kodo for. Stampeding Kodo you also run for all sorts of other low attack threats. I think Bookworm could see some competitive play. It's certainly going to be decent in Dragon Priest, and that overall it's a good card. The question is, how strong is it on turn 6? Will there be metagame targets for it? If so, I expect this card to see competitive play. Oof. After running through this list just a little bit longer, oh man. Moat Lurker. Tice thinks it's bad, but I don't know. This is an interesting card. I think this one is also difficult to evaluate at a glance. Moat Lurker, a 6 mana 3/3, so the stats are absolutely awful. Like, we're comparing, again, it to Boulderfist Ogre, which is our vanilla buddy that doesn't see any competitive play. And, its flavor text says, me have very good stats for cost. Moat Lurker has very bad stats for cost. 6 mana 3/3 is about as bad as we've ever seen, and it destroys a minion, which is great. So it has an Assassinate tacked onto it. So it has an Assassinate tacked onto it, which is like a 5 mana value, which is great. Here's the problem. Death Rattle resummons the minion you killed. So if you kill an enemy minion, they get it back once Moat Lurker dies. It comes into play under their control, not yours, so you don't steal the minion. If this thing was just a 6 mana 3/3 battlecry destroy minion, it would actually be really good, because Assassinate is worth 5 mana. Sure, Assassinate doesn't really see that much competitive play, but you're getting a really big discount putting in a body. The problem is Death Rattle resummon it. It makes Moat Lurker such a weird card. It's worth noting, though, that you can destroy your own minions, and I think a really good combo for this guy is going to be Sylvanas Windrunner. Death Rattle, take control of random enemy minion. Moat Lurker is going to be very strong at proccing your own Death Rattles and then proccing it again. The thing is that using it on enemy minions isn't generally going to be that great, because it's going to be difficult to protect the 3/3 body that late into the game. Overall, I think this card's really cute. I'm going to play around with it a lot. It really remains to be seen how good it is, but you can always play it with Shadow Step too. You got some interesting options. You eat a minion, you Shadow Step it back to your hand, and then they don't get their minion back. You can also use the Brewmaster on it to return it to your hand. Moat Lurker seems okay. It's something that's certainly worth experimenting with. Also, you could silence it. Maybe this is the type of thing that makes Purify good. We'll see. Moving on, we have Arcane Giant. This is one of the giant cards in Hearthstone, and one that I think will actually be excellent, so I rate this card very highly. Arcane Giant, a 12 mana minion, which means you can't play it normally since you're capped at 10 mana crystals. And it's an 8/8, costs 1 less for each spell you've cast this game. Good news is that classes like Rogue and Mage and Druid, etc. will be able to leverage this ability incredibly nicely. I would say that more often than not, you're not paying anywhere near 12 for the Arcane Giant, especially if you built the deck around it. More often than not, you're probably spending close to 4 mana. In which a 4 mana 8/8, sign me up. That's usually what Mountain Giant is if you're playing it in a handlock deck. So, if I search for Mountain, it shows me the Blackrock Mountain cards. Cool. Arcane Giant, I think, is going to be a great card, and it's also very, very strong with Yogg-Saron, and this is a card that I do expect to see a rather significant amount of competitive play and heavy experimentation. I would rate it as one of the higher cards of the set. It's probably not as good as Menagerie Warden, but it's a strong card. This card will see some play. You just run a lot of removal cards. Maybe even Priest ends up playing this. It's something that I heavily encourage people to experiment with. Moving on. Ooh, Moroes. This card's not very good. In fact, this card's pretty bad. For the most part, throughout my review, I've been like, well, this card is okay. It could see some competitive play. It has some potential. I generally try to be more on the optimistic side, and then there are just some cards that are really good. Moroes is certainly on the lower end of the spectrum. Moroes is a 3 mana 1/1, so absolutely abysmal stats. He has stealth, so it means he can't be targeted by enemy players, but he can still die to area of effect attacks. You can still target him. By the way, you could still buff him. And to the end of your turn, he summons a 1/1 Steward. The Steward has no card text on it. It's a vanilla 1/1, much like the Silver Hand Recruit, except it has no positive interactions with it. How good does that make Moroes? Not so great. The best combo I can think with Moroes is going to be with Steward of Darkshire. which would give all of the little stewards Divine Shield. You play with a lot of buff cards. You could buff Moroes himself, so that he's harder to remove. I just think that Moroes is not going to see really any competitive play at all because of cards like Ravaging Ghoul, which kind of dominate the current metagame. It's going to be so easy to clear Moroes and all of his 1/1 stewards. And also, if we look at the card, it's a 3-mana 1/1. At the end of your turn, thank God, not at the start of your turn, he summons a 1/1 steward. So he's essentially a 3-mana 2/2, which is really bad. But it could be worse, and then the next turn, he's a 3-mana 3/3. Moroes has to live for 2 turns to become a 3-mana 4/4 and then be strong enough to consider playing him. So he's just 5 for 2 turns after you play him, before he starts generating value. This card is so slow that I don't even think I would play it. And I'm such a greedy Hearthstone player, so... Moroes is alright, like, maybe he's not as bad as he gets credit for, but there are just so many easy ways to deal 1 damage to him. He just dies to all AoEs. He's so frail and he's so slow that the only reason why this card would ever be good is the redundancy factor, where you play Moroes and he baits out a Consecration, so since he baited out the Consecration, that means you can actually start playing good cards after that, and you don't need to worry about your opponent having AoE. Because people are going to maybe overreact and just try and blow up Moroes as fast as possible, and then that means you don't need to worry as much about dealing with your opponent's area of effect spells, so... Maybe Moroes is helpful in like a token-style deck, just for the redundancy factor. And we already looked at Barnes before in part 1. Prince Malchezaar. 5-mana, 5/6 legendary demon. When the game starts, add 5 extra legendary minions to your deck. This is a card that is really interesting, and I think the most immediate, obvious comparison is going to be Elise Starseeker. Elise Starseeker is Battlecry, shuffle the map to the Golden Monkey into your deck. When you draw the Golden Monkey, the map to the Golden Monkey, it's a 2-mana spell. Shuffles the Golden Monkey in your deck. When you play the Golden Monkey, it turns all the remaining cards in your hand and deck into legendary minions. The monkey itself is a strong card. Prince Malchezaar just adds 5 extra legendary minions to your deck. Legendary minions are generally more on the late game side of things, so having some extra legendaries you would think would strengthen your late game. However, I don't think this card is that great because even though it means you hit fatigue a lot slower than your opponent, and you have 5 extra cards to play with, and they're more than likely going to be huge ones, sometimes they're Moroes. That doesn't help with your late game at all. I don't think you want to see Moroes in your deck under most circumstances. Unless you're playing for the redundancy factor. You know, you could end up with Lore Walker Cho, Millhouse Mana Storm. There are a lot of really bad legendary minions out there that Prince Malchezaar might end up, you know, being the card that puts a lot of garbage in your deck and that stops you from drawing the cards you need to draw. What if you really need to draw a Consecration, and then instead you end up top decking Lore Walker Cho? Feels really bad. So I don't think that Prince Malchezaar will see that much competitive play at a glance. He's going to take some very creative deck building to where the downside of, you know, reducing consistency in your deck, I think a lot of people would end up playing cards if they could, like in a 28-card deck, just to make their deck more consistent. You know, that's why even though I think a lot of new players misevaluate Arcane Intellect, because even though Arcane Intellect costs a card in itself and you're technically only drawing 1 new card, you're playing with 28 cards in your deck, which means that you're more than likely to draw and see the things you need to either assemble your combo or to just get the board clears and cards you need to stay alive. And Prince Malchezaar makes it a little bit harder. Still, though, it's only 5 legendaries, so it's not going to mess up your consistency that much, and it's very possible that someone designs a very strong deck that can take advantage of this without being hurt so much by the consistency. Perhaps that deck is going to actually be discard Warlock, because now you have 5 additional cards to discard. So even if you have some bad legendaries, you just discard them, and if you have some good ones, you just play them. This card is very interesting. I look forward to playing around with it. Moving on, we've already covered the Curator in the previous part, and I believe, yes, Medivh is going to be the final card before I finally pass out. Medivh is a 8-mana legendary minion. He's neutral, so all classes can use him. 8-mana 7/7, Battlecry, equip Atesh, Great Staff of the Guardian. This is the first time we've ever had like a neutral weapon that people can just equip in Hearthstone. That's so cool. And also, it's a weapon that doesn't really function like any other. Let's take a look at Atesh. Atesh is a 3-mana, 1/3 weapon. After you cast a spell, summon a random minion of that cost, lose 1 durability. So the effect is immediately comparable to Summoning Stone, which is a card that doesn't see that much competitive play. It's actually seen some believe it or not, but not that much, because the 5-mana 0/6 body is awful. Sure, Summoning Stone's kind of hard to remove, but it can't really trade or give you any presence on the board. Good news is, Attach is a lot harder to remove than a Summoning Stone is, because it's a weapon that just stays in play. So even if they kill Medivh, you still have the weapon equipped, and then 3 turns after that, you get 3 charges of your Summoning Stone. And Summoning Stone's ability is crazy. It's also worth noting, by the way, that... Let's take a look at Twisting Nether here. Atesh summons the random minion of that cost after you cast the spell, which means that you can Twisting Nether to clear the entire board, and then summon an 8-mana minion. Wouldn't you love to clear the board, and then summon Rag? Then you summon Ragnaros the Firelord. That's actually going to be very strong tempo swing. So overall, I would say that Medivh is a card that is immediately comparable to Rafaam, one that a lot of people are sleeping on and has seen fringe competitive play, whereas Rafaam is a very expensive, slow legendary minion that is so strong if you're not dead before you play him. And Medivh is, I think, very similar, where you play him, and if you're not already dead, you might just win. Medivh is the type of card, though, that could just open up a ton of new deck archetypes. I think this card is very strong, and it's just metagame dependent like Rafaam. If the metagame was actually slower, then I think Rafaam would be very, very good. And if the metagame slows down in any way, then Medivh could be absolutely bonkers. However, if Medivh goes out of control, I expect a lot of people will end up running their Harrison Jones to deal with him. Put that staff in a museum. Or they'll be running Acidic Swamp Ooze, which, by the way, for your new player, is something that you should be running in a lot of your decks. So, yeah, Medivh seems very, very good. I think you would run him with a lot of, super expensive spells, and you don't even necessarily need to build a deck around him, but like Twisting Nether is a good one, Doom, Flame Strike, Blizzard, Mind Control maybe, Light Bomb. There are a lot of really interesting things you can do with Medivh, and I expect to see it experimented with in a lot of classes. You can play with Call of the Wild. Medivh is a really sick card. I mean, I don't think you're gonna, play Captain Greenskin to buff it or upgrade the weapon, but maybe you do. I know I'm gonna try and do that, so... Yeah, I really like Medivh the Guardian. It's gonna be one of those, like, metagame dependent legendaries, and it just really depends on how fast or how slow the format is. Overall, I think it's an excellent card. I compare it to Rafaam, whereas if the metagame is slower, Rafaam would see a lot of play. Similarly, I think Medivh will see a lot of play in a slower metagame as well. And as always, I'm really interested in your guys' feedback, so if you enjoyed watching this video, then please do let me know, as I had a blast doing this series, and this is exactly the type of thing that I like to do. Please let me know if you think that I did a good job explaining the concepts really clearly, and you understood everything, and some of the things that you enjoyed about this video, and also if you have any ideas for the new cards that we see coming out. What kind of decks are you going to try and put Medivh into? Are you going to try a triple tribe deck? Do you think that could work? I would like to hear all of your guys' thoughts. So again, thank you so much for the support. I really appreciate it. This is the type of thing that I'm having an absolute blast doing, and I'd love to continue doing Hearthstone content as well as content for other games. So thank you so much for, helping me keep the channel afloat, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the future. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for watching.